20 years after his wife was declared dead, Ethan is locking his shop when the bell rings. Outside, rain pours down, just like that old night. A middle-aged woman stands in the doorway, hair gray now, a scar where he used to kiss her every morning. His keys slip from his hand. "Leah." She steps back, startled. "I'm sorry. People call me Anna." Beside her stands a young woman, maybe 19. When she looks at him, Ethan sees his own eyes staring back. She holds out a folded test result. "My name is Mira. Your son is my brother." She pauses. "I think you're my father." Ethan Rowan is 49 years old, restoring old photographs for grieving families, coaxing faded faces back into focus one careful brushstroke at a time in his small storefront shop. There's one photograph, though, he has never once agreed to restore. The last picture ever taken of his wife, Leah, sitting untouched in a drawer for 2 decades. After the accident, he searched for nearly 2 years before finally being forced to accept the legal declaration of her death, signing paperwork that felt, at the time, like signing away a piece of himself he'd never get back. He raised their son, Jonah, alone from the age of 3. He learned to braid hair before school recitals, fumbling with ribbons in front of the bathroom mirror at 6 in the morning. He worked 2 jobs just to keep the rent paid, some weeks barely sleeping between shifts. He sat outside his son's bedroom door more nights than he can count, whenever Jonah asked, through tears, why his mother never came home. Ethan doesn't consider himself some perfect, faithful widower, though people around town often described him that way. He never moved on, not really, because some part of him always feared that loving someone else would mean finally admitting Leah was truly gone for good. Tonight's encounter unfolds nothing like anything Ethan ever allowed himself to imagine, even in his most desperate moments of hope over the years spent waiting by the phone. He brings Anna and Mira inside out of the rain, offering towels, offering chairs, his hands trembling slightly as he moves around the small shop. He notices things almost immediately, small details that catch in his chest like splinters he can't quite pull free. The way Anna runs her finger along the rim of her cup when she's nervous, exactly the way Leah always did during arguments. The old scar on her wrist from a childhood bicycle accident. The way she tilts her head slightly while listening, waiting for someone else to finish speaking first before offering her own thoughts. But Anna looks at him like a complete stranger, her expression polite but distant. She doesn't remember their wedding, doesn't remember the small backyard ceremony under string lights. She doesn't remember the house they built together over years of careful saving. She doesn't remember the 3-year-old boy she once tucked into bed every single night, singing the same lullaby until he fell asleep. This, somehow, hurts Ethan more deeply than her absence ever did over the past 20 years. The woman standing in front of him wears his wife's face, carries her exact voice, but holds none of the love he spent 2 decades waiting to have returned to him. Mira finally explains why they've come, her voice steady despite the obvious nerves underneath. Jonah, it turns out, had taken a genetic test months earlier, hoping to trace some distant relatives on his mother's side of the family. 2 months ago, Mira received her own results, showing a match consistent with full siblings rather than distant cousins. She followed the trail through public records late into several nights and eventually found Leah's photograph listed among the missing victims of the 2006 accident. She kept the discovery hidden for weeks afterward, afraid of several things at once. Afraid Ethan would see her mother as nothing more than lost property finally being reclaimed. Afraid Jonah would resent both of them entirely for disrupting his life. Afraid Anna would be forced to become someone she no longer remembers being, erased in the process. Ethan calls Jonah over that same evening, telling him only that something concerning his mother has come up, nothing more specific than that over the phone. Jonah walks in still wearing his work uniform, looks at Anna, and immediately recognizes the face from childhood photographs he's kept tucked away in an old shoebox for years. He doesn't embrace her. His first question cuts straight through the room like a blade. "If you're really my mother, why did you let us wait 20 years? Anna has no answer for him, opening her mouth and closing it again. Mira steps slightly in front of her mother, a small, protective gesture that reveals just how long she's been shielding Anna from moments exactly like this one. Jonah realizes, watching this unfold, that the mother he's spent his whole life longing for is now seeking safety behind a different daughter entirely, one he never knew existed until tonight. Before leaving that night, Anna's eyes land on a small red toy train sitting on a nearby shelf, dusty from years of display, the same one Jonah once clutched tightly on the last day he ever saw his mother. She whispers quietly, almost to herself, unaware she's speaking aloud at all. "There was a boy who used to count its wheels over and over, but I don't remember his face." Jonah goes completely still, color draining from his own face. That detail was never in any newspaper. It was never in any accident report anywhere, filed away or otherwise. The truth gets formally confirmed within days, both sides agreeing to move forward carefully despite the emotional weight involved. Ethan agrees to a direct paternity test, but only on the strict condition that Mira participates entirely of her own free will, with no pressure from anyone involved in the process. The results come back conclusive within the week. Ethan is Mira's biological father, and Jonah and Mira, it turns out, are full siblings, not simply half-siblings connected through only one shared parent. This single fact proves something enormous, something nobody had considered until the lab confirmed it in writing. Leah had already been pregnant before the accident ever happened, a detail nobody in either family had known until this exact moment sitting across from each other in Ethan's small kitchen, piecing together hospital records and fragments of Anna's own recollection over several difficult conversations. The full picture of what actually happened slowly emerges. Leah was found several days after the accident, discovered in an area located dozens of miles downstream from where the crash occurred, barely conscious when rescuers reached her. She had no identification on her, severe injuries, and absolutely no memory of her own name or where she'd once lived. Her wallet, found near the wreckage itself, led authorities to assume she'd simply been swept away and lost entirely beneath the floodwaters. She was admitted to the hospital and registered as an unidentified patient, a case number rather than a name typed onto her intake chart. Because of estimation errors around her age, jurisdictional boundaries between different counties, and record systems that, at the time, simply weren't connected to one another the way they are now, the two separate case files were never once matched together, not in 20 full years of searching on Ethan's part. A rehabilitation nurse eventually started calling her Anna, a name that simply stuck, and after years of failing to locate any surviving relatives, she adopted that name permanently, slowly rebuilding an entire life around it from nothing. She learned she was pregnant while still recovering in that facility, with absolutely no way of knowing who the father might be or where to even begin looking. The story reveals a striking emotional symmetry between both households that neither family fully recognized until now. Ethan raised Jonah alone, believing the entire time that Leah had died in that flood. Anna raised Mira alone, believing the entire time that some nameless father had either abandoned them both or never even known they existed at all. Jonah grew up with a father but no mother to speak of. Mira grew up with a mother but no father anywhere in the picture. Both of them, at different points in their childhoods, watched other families gathered whole and complete around dinner tables, quietly wondering what they themselves had done wrong to deserve something less than that. Tension builds quickly between the two siblings once the full truth settles in over the following days. Jonah feels a sharp pang of envy, knowing Mira had 19 full years by their mother's side, years he never got to have with anyone. Mira pushes back hard, pointing out that Jonah at least had a father who walked him to school every morning, showed up for every single birthday without fail, and protected him every single day of his life growing up. Jonah snaps at one point during a heated exchange, the words slipping out before he can stop them. "At least your mother chose to stay with you." Mira answers just as sharply, her voice rising to match his. "She didn't choose me over you. She didn't even know you existed." Both of them slowly realize, standing there in stunned silence afterward, they've been quietly punishing each other for a decision neither of them ever actually made or had any control over. Meanwhile, Ethan tries to rebuild the past far too quickly, moving faster than anyone around him is emotionally ready for. He brings Anna back to their old house, the one he's kept largely unchanged for 2 decades, still holding on to the hope that walking through those familiar rooms might jog something loose in her memory. He cooks Leah's favorite meal from scratch, spending hours in the kitchen getting every detail right, plays their wedding song softly in the background from an old record player he's kept stored away, and lays out old photographs across the kitchen table in front of her, one after another, watching her face for any flicker of recognition. He keeps asking, again and again, "Do you remember?" Anna tries desperately to please him, forcing a smile through most of the evening, nodding along politely even when nothing feels familiar at all. But the mounting pressure quickly sends her into a quiet panic she can't quite hide from him. She eventually admits, her voice barely steady, that the entire evening feels like attending the funeral of someone who happens to share her exact face and voice, a stranger being mourned in her own presence. At the end of that difficult night, Ethan finally asks the question he's carried for 20 long years. "Do you remember ever loving me?" Anna answers slowly, choosing each word with obvious care. "I believe the woman in these photographs loved you very much. But I can't lie to you and say I'm still her." Jonah finally confesses something he's kept buried for most of his life, the words coming slowly, painfully, during a quiet conversation on the back porch one evening. As a child, he often pretended not to remember his mother at all, purely so Ethan would stop grieving so openly in front of him, swallowing his own confusion just to protect his father from more pain. Every time his father told stories about Leah, retelling the same memories over and over across the years, Jonah felt, somewhere deep down, like he was competing against a dead woman for his own father's attention, a competition he could never possibly win. He blames Ethan, quietly but firmly, for turning their entire household around decades of waiting instead of actually living, for keeping the house frozen in a moment that never actually returned. Mira's fear, it turns out, has never really been about losing Ethan at all, despite how it might have appeared to everyone else watching from the outside. It's always been about losing her mother instead, the only parent she's ever known. For years, Mira has quietly supported Anna through fragmented memory episodes, gently reminding her of appointments she'd otherwise forget entirely, carefully writing down recurring nightmares in a small notebook kept by her mother's bed, reassuring her mother, night after night, that the blurred, faceless images in her dreams didn't mean she was losing her mind. Now, suddenly, everyone keeps asking whether Anna remembers Ethan, whether she remembers Jonah, whether pieces of the old life are finally resurfacing. Nobody once asks whether she actually wants to keep the life she's already built for herself, brick by careful brick, over 19 difficult years. Mira is terrified that if Leah comes back in some full, complete sense, Anna Vale, the mother Mira has always known and loved fiercely, will simply disappear entirely, replaced by someone else altogether, someone Mira never actually got the chance to meet herself. An old records office eventually leads them to a small box, long stored alongside personal belongings once collected from unidentified patients decades ago, forgotten in some archive basement until now. Inside, they find a single button, small and unremarkable. A water-damaged photograph fragment, its edges soft with age. An envelope, its ink almost entirely illegible now after 20 years of storage in imperfect conditions. And a folded, worn pregnancy test result. The paper brittle in Ethan's hands as he unfolds it carefully. Ethan realizes immediately, his breath catching, that the torn photograph fragment is the missing piece from their very last family photo together. A photo he's kept, incomplete, in a drawer for 2 decades, always wondering what the missing corner might have shown. The twist arrives all at once. Leah never actually left her family behind. Not the way Ethan has believed for 20 years. Inside the envelope is a letter Leah had been intending to give him before the accident ever happened. Before that fateful night, the two of them had argued bitterly, Ethan convinced, after months of strain in their marriage, that she was finally leaving him for good. But Leah, it turns out, had just discovered she was pregnant. She'd boarded that train to visit her sister, seeking advice, and was on her way home again when the accident occurred. The surviving portion of the letter reads simply, "I'm not leaving. I'm only afraid we forgot how to tell each other the truth. If you still want this, I want us to start again. All 4 of us." That 4th person, unmistakably, was Mira, not yet born. Ethan understands all at once that for 20 entire years, he has lived under the mistaken belief that his own final words drove his wife away from him. An even more important emotional twist follows close behind. Ethan believes, in that moment, that the letter alone will help Anna finally remember everything, that it might restore their entire life together in a single instant. Without asking first, he plays an old audio recording of Leah's voice from 20 years earlier. Anna listens to her own voice from 2 decades ago and doesn't recognize it at all. She breaks down crying, not from any sudden flood of memory, but from the overwhelming feeling of being forced to compete against a dead version of herself. "You don't see me," she tells him, voice shaking. "You only look through me," searching for her. Mira quickly leads her mother away. Even Jonah turns on his father in that moment. Angry that Ethan wanted a beautiful ending so badly, he stopped seeing the people actually standing in pain right in front of him. Ethan's lowest point arrives that same night. He sits alone in his shop long after closing, surrounded by hundreds of restored photographs belonging to other people's families, other people's histories, faces he spent years repairing for strangers. He pulls out his own wedding photo with Leah and studies it for a long, silent time, tracing the edge of the frame with one finger. For the first time in 20 years, he fully accepts that Leah being alive doesn't automatically mean their marriage is alive too, that the two things were never actually the same thing at all. He sends Anna a single message that night, choosing each word carefully, deleting and rewriting the sentence more than once before finally hitting send. "You don't owe me Leah's memories. If you're willing, I'd like to get to know who Anna actually is." Anna doesn't respond right away that night, and Ethan doesn't sleep much waiting, checking his phone more times than he'd like to admit. The following morning, when Ethan opens the shop, he finds the damaged family photograph sitting outside his door, propped carefully against the frame, along with a small handwritten note tucked beneath it. "Don't fix the missing part. Help me understand the part that's still here." Ethan changes his entire approach after that morning, something visibly shifting in the way he carries himself around her. He stops taking Anna to old, familiar places from their shared past, no more surprise visits to landmarks meant to trigger recognition. He stops asking, "Do you remember this?" entirely, retiring the question for good. Instead, he starts asking about her actual life as it exists now, genuinely curious rather than searching for evidence of someone else. Her job at the local library, the quiet satisfaction she finds shelving returned books each morning, the books she genuinely loves, the worn paperbacks stacked on her nightstand, the way she's raised Mira all these years, the sacrifices nobody ever thanked her for, the specific things that make her feel safe in the world, the small routines she's built for herself out of necessity. Slowly, week by week, Ethan begins seeing Anna as a complete, whole person in her own right, not simply an empty vessel meant to carry his wife's old memories back to him. Ethan also apologizes directly to Mira, something he should have done far sooner than he did. He admits that he initially looked at her eyes as proof, as evidence, long before he ever looked at her as an actual daughter deserving of his attention. Mira confesses, in turn, that she never came looking for some perfect, idealized father figure. She simply wanted to understand why some part of her life had always felt quietly incomplete, without ever knowing exactly why. Ethan tells her honestly, "I can't make up for 19 missing years, but if you'll let me, I can be here, starting today, and every day after that." Jonah and Mira slowly find their own way toward each other too. Not through any grand speech or dramatic reconciliation staged for anyone's benefit, but through small, ordinary things that quietly add up over time, the way real relationships usually do. They both, it turns out, hate raisins with equal passion, a discovery that sends them both into unexpected laughter one evening at dinner. They both rub their thumbs together when they're anxious, an identical nervous habit neither of them ever noticed before, something inherited without either of them realizing it. They both laugh, helplessly, at their father's genuinely terrible puns, groaning and grinning at the same time despite themselves. Jonah eventually hands Mira the old red toy train one quiet afternoon, explaining that he's kept it all these years to remember their mother, but that maybe now it belongs to both their stories equally, not just his own, a small object finally shared between them instead of held alone. One small memory does resurface unexpectedly, arriving without any warning at all. When Ethan accidentally burns a batch of pancakes one morning, smoke curling toward the ceiling, Anna suddenly laughs out loud, catching herself off guard by the sound of her own laughter. She remembers, faintly, a morning long ago when Ethan did the exact same thing. When Leah threw open the kitchen window to clear the smoke while a young Jonah ran laughing circles around the table, delighted by the chaos of it all. It isn't some miraculous full recovery of memory, nothing like the dramatic breakthrough Ethan once hoped for. It's just one small, fragile piece returning gently on its own, unforced and unprompted. Ethan doesn't push her for more, resisting every instinct to ask follow-up questions. He simply says, quietly, "Thank you for telling me that." It's precisely this restraint, this refusal to force anything further out of her, that finally lets Anna feel genuinely safe around him for the first time since they met again. Anna admits something honestly toward the end of that conversation. "I still haven't remembered what it felt like to love you." Ethan answers gently, without a trace of disappointment in his voice. "Then we don't need to start from love. We can start from the truth instead." 6 months pass. Anna rents a small apartment near Ethan's shop, close enough to visit easily, though she doesn't move back into their old house, choosing something new instead of something reclaimed from a life that no longer quite fits her. She restores the name Leah on her legal paperwork after careful thought, while still keeping Anna as part of who she genuinely is today, both names belonging to her now rather than replacing each other entirely. Ethan and Leah haven't remarried, and neither of them rushes toward that conversation. They meet every week, sometimes talking about the past, sifting gently through old memories together, but mostly, increasingly, simply getting to know who each other actually is right now, in the present, without pressure attached to where it might eventually lead. The two siblings are no longer rivals competing over stolen years. The resentment that once sat between them gradually replaced by something closer to genuine closeness. Jonah helps Mira move into her college dorm that fall, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs without complaint, staying late to help her arrange furniture exactly the way she wants it. Mira calls him directly whenever their mother has a difficult night, choosing to share the weight instead of carrying it entirely alone the way she always used to before any of this began. Jonah comes to understand that having a sister doesn't erase or diminish any of his own childhood memories, that there's room enough for both. Mira comes to understand that finding her father was never a betrayal of the mother who raised her single-handedly, year after year, with nobody else to help her through it. The story closes on a simple image. Ethan sets up a camera to take the family's first photograph together in 20 full years. At first, Leah instinctively stands exactly where she once stood in their last photo together, decades earlier. Then, quietly, she steps to a different spot entirely, choosing her own place this time. Nobody asks her to move back. Mira stands beside Ethan. Jonah stands beside Leah. Just before the timer finishes counting down, Leah reaches over and pulls Ethan a little closer toward her. An unplanned, unguarded gesture nobody could have staged. The photograph doesn't replace what was lost all those years ago. It simply proves that this family, in whatever new shape it's found, is still capable of building an actual future together. One they're choosing freely this time, rather than one forced upon them by circumstance or grief. 20 years ago, Ethan lost a wife, and each child lost either a father or a mother they never got the chance to know. But on the day they finally found each other again, healing didn't begin by trying to restore everything that had been lost. It began the moment they all stopped demanding that each other become the people they used to be 20 years before. Loving someone doesn't mean owning their past. The truth can set us free, but it doesn't automatically heal every wound on its own. A reunited family needs time, needs boundaries, needs everyone's honest consent moving forward together. Someone who returns after profound loss doesn't owe anyone a continuation of the exact life that was interrupted. If someone you loved came back after many years, but had become an entirely different person, would you try to restore the old love you remember? Or would you learn to love the person actually standing in front of you now? Share your thoughts below, and follow along if you believe second chances aren't always meant to rewrite the past, but to build something kinder going forward instead.